Divine Truth Assistance Group. Group assistance sessions, putting principles of divine truth into action. This recording is from the Developing My Loving Self group and is part of an Education in Love series. In the creation of My Real Self presentation, Jesus examines the choice God made to create our soul, which is our real self. What our condition was at the time of creation and incarnation, what God's creation of ourselves tells us and summarizes our current undeveloped state. Recorded on the 27th of May 2016 in Noosa, Queensland, Australia.
Now, this section of our program, the reality is I could spend months on it. So, you're only going to get, again, one of those skim across the top discussions on these subjects now. But hopefully they'll give you many things to ponder and also some things to experiment with when it comes to developing your loving self. So now we've come to the part of the program which is about developing my loving self. So the whole of the next 2 days we'll be discussing what you need to understand to help you develop your loving self. And obviously part of developing your loving self is about removing your unloving self. So let's assume that we've understood our unloving self and we've removed our unloving self, or we're in the process of removing our unloving self. And this is about developing our loving self now. What do we need to know and do in order to develop our loving self, to become more loving, if you like. Now, this part of the program relates a lot and can be engaged also at the same time as the other part of the program can be engaged. So it doesn't have to be sort of put off until you've developed, until you've deconstructed your facade. In some ways, it's almost like your real self and your unloving self, the hurt self and the facade selves, can be two of them can be deconstructed simultaneously to the other being constructed. But before we can do anything about it, we need to understand the creation of my real self. We need to understand how God created us. And we need to understand God's truth about how God created us. So that's what we're going to do now. Try to understand some truth about how God created us and the state we are in right now as well. Okay, so let's focus on God's creation of ourselves, of myself. I'll write a statement. I am the pinnacle of God's creation. But I want to define I. I is my entire soul. So whenever you say I, you're really not saying, you're not really talking about the same thing, are we? So whenever I say I, I'm talking about Mary and I, both of us together as one. All right, so in my case, it's like this. And that part of the soul has been named by my first parents, because it's the very first incarnation that you really take most of your names from. So that part of my soul is Jesus, and that part of my soul is Mary. And Mary Magdalene we're referring to there, right? But we are one person, one being, one soul. that make sense? Okay. Now that is a very, very, I've said this to you many times before, and still the majority of you just do not get it. It's a very significant truth. Because it's the whole soul that has a relationship with God. It's the whole soul that can be developed in love. Now, there's a number of things in here that you probably haven't given too much thought about every time we've raised this issue. What does it mean that I am the pinnacle of God's creation? Well, let's talk a bit about what that means. It means that you are the most complex of all of God's creations. The human soul is actually more complex than the universe in which the human soul lives. The human soul is the most complex of all of God's creations, and the human soul is actually more complex than the physical universe in which the human soul lives. So now that opens a wide, you could say a whole, lifetime of investigation that would open, wouldn't it? If you think about it, you can spend tens of millions of years examining the universe, and you still won't know its full complexity. What does that tell you about the human soul? That you could spend the same amount trying to understand the human soul, and you still won't know its full complexity. Because the human soul is a very interesting creation by God in that it's constantly changing based on how much love it receives. So just when you think you've caught up with, understanding how it is right now, you receive a little bit more love, and all of a sudden the human soul has new capacities that it didn't have before. And therefore it's just become a little bit more complex than it did before. So the human soul is a growing complexity. The difference between the human soul and the universe itself is that there are fixed laws that govern the universe, and I suppose you could say there are also fixed laws that govern the human soul, but the universe itself does expand, but it expands in the same manner in which, or under the control of, the human soul. The human soul is not only the most complex of God's creations, but also has the most potential for change of all of God's creations. It is also the only one of God's creations that is self-realizing. And that in itself causes huge amounts of complexity. It's the only one to whom God gave the gift of free will. That in itself causes huge amounts of complexity. Because it means that God had to create a whole series of laws which are just specific to and for only the human soul and the way in which it would grow. And if the human soul didn't exist, all of God's highest laws would not exist either. Because all of the highest laws in the universe all relate to the human soul. So all of the laws that are surrounding the laws of divine love, some of which we've talked about, laws of desire, forgiveness, repentance, the laws governing the reception of God's love and so forth, they are the most powerful laws in the universe, and they govern the way the human soul operates. And the least complex of the laws governing the human soul is the law of compensation. Di, you'd like to ask?